Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Mr. Deputy Mayor, Secretary of State, Your Excellencies, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to the Ismaili Centre, and a particularly warm welcome to guests and visitors who are here for the very first time. The Ismaili Centre lecture series has been going on for now some 10, 12 years. And it's a series which really looks at some of the big issues of our time, covering topics such as science, healthcare, education, the economy. And our topic for today, the shale gas revolution, is certainly a topic that has captured people's imagination and drawn a lot of debate and discussion, a lot of public interest. And so I think it's right that we should be discussing it today, looking at the speed with which the US, the North Americans, have embraced shale gas. I think it's appropriate that we should be asking ourselves whether we should be looking to mirror that experience here in the UK. First, perhaps, let me just say a word or two about the Ismaili Centre and the lecture series here. This is really a forum that brings together government, business, academia, but it's also a forum that gives voice to civil society and civil society organizations. And we see this as very important because civil society can play a very important part in a number of the issues that we face today. The Ismaili community, part of our civil society here, is a faith community, but we have a very long-standing tradition of expressing our faith, the social conscience of Islam, through institutional activity. And so the Aga Khan Development Network, or the AKDN as we call it, is a development agency that now operates in over 30 countries, employs over 80,000 people, and is perhaps the largest private development agency in the world today. And it's probably better known for some of the work it does in the areas of schools, hospitals, universities, international development, humanitarian assistance, architecture, and the arts. But it's a good example of an institution that can bring solutions and that provides some input and makes a contribution to some of the issues that we face. Today we're talking about energy, and some of the work of the AKDN touches on energy too. The Azito power plant in Côte d'Ivoire, in the Ivory Coast, was one of the first energy projects that AKDN was involved with. At the time, probably the largest power projects in sub-Saharan Africa, and brought energy to Côte d'Ivoire, to the Ivory Coast, serving something like 40 to 50% of the country's energy needs, including allowing the country to export energy to some of its neighbors. Pamir Energy is another example of the work of the AKDN. Pamir Energy brought renewable energy to the Gorno-Badakhshan region of Tajikistan and to Afghanistan, and allowed now, I think, something like 95% of the inhabitants of that region to get access to affordable electricity. The Bujagali power station in Uganda, I see we have a few Ugandans here today. The Bujagali power station in Uganda, another hydro project, another renewables project, is one which has increased generation capacity in Uganda by 50%. I mention these as examples of where civil society can bring solutions. The topic that we're discussing today, of course, is shale gas, and this is why I think this is the topic that is of relevance to all of us. Questions that are being asked about shale gas are whether the government is procuring the right value for property rights, what is the real risk that we face from an environmental perspective, is methane gas a real issue that we should be worried about? Has the crisis in Ukraine made the issue a lot more sensitive now in terms of protecting our own gas supplies? So a number of questions, and I think we're very fortunate that we have with us today a very distinguished panel who can hopefully help answer some of these questions. So with that, thank you all for coming, and I'm going to hand over to Galib to moderate the discussion. Welcome. Thank you.
President Mauji, thank you very much for that introduction. As you said, shale gas and fracking is a very topical issue. Yesterday, our Prime Minister, David Cameron, said fracking will be, quote, good for our country, unquote, and he blamed the lack of, quote, lack of understanding about the process for some of the opposition to shale gas, unquote. So what we're hoping today is to try and dispel some of the myths and realities, and we're joined by a very distinguished panel as introduced earlier. But before I ask my panelists to start, and the way we're going to run the evening is I'm going to ask a leading question to each of the panelists. They will have about 10 minutes to talk around that question. We're going to have a discussion for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to you for a Q&A for about 10 to 15 minutes. But I just wanted to take a poll of how many of you understand what fracking is? Okay, about 38%. Okay. How many of you feel that shale gas will bring a lot of money and economic benefits and will lead to lower gas prices for you? About 36%. How many of you believe shale gas poses serious concerns to the environment? About 14%. Okay, you've got a biased audience here. And how many of you will vote in next year's election based on the government's stance on fracking?
I can go home then.
None of you. Okay. So you've got that. So I want to ask my first question to the Right Honourable Edward Davey, who's the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change. He's been an MP for Kingston and Surbiton since 1997. He's been Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change since 2012. He attended Nottingham High School, where he was head boy. And whilst at Oxford, he was a JCR president of Jesus College. As a teenager, he worked at Boots. Right Honourable, can you start by giving us a summary of the scale of the UK shale gas opportunity? What's the government support that's available, and what are the environmental concerns?
Well, with great pleasure, and can I first of all say what a pleasure it is to be here at the Ismaili Centre and to be talking to you. Earlier today I gave a statement to the House of Commons, so I think it'll be more polite tonight and probably a more constructive debate. But, you know, the truth is there's an awful lot spoken about the environmental problems of shale gas and that it's some sort of economic revolution. And I think we need to get away from the hyperbole on both sides. I don't think it is a chimera that it's threatening to our environment, some of the ways that some people think. But equally, I don't think it's some silver bullet to solve our economic problems or even our energy problems. Having said that, I'm a huge supporter of shale gas. So let me explain why, first of all, I think it is important for our energy policy and has real opportunity. When you look at energy policy, there are three things that we're trying to pull together. One is we're trying to make sure energy is affordable. Second, we're trying to make sure we've got enough energy, energy security, we keep the lights on and so on. And thirdly, we're trying to make sure that energy is playing its part in tackling climate change and reducing the carbon emissions from our use of energy. So you've got what's called the energy trilemma of price, security, and decarbonisation. And in at least two of those, shale gas can play a role. Its most important contribution is on the energy security side. We will need an awful lot of gas in the UK for many years to come as we decarbonise. We're going to have to get rid of our coal power stations over the next 10 years. And to fill that gap, and to fill the gap left by 8 of our 9 nuclear power stations closing between now and 2023, we're going to have a lot of renewables, a lot of new nuclear, and we're going to have a lot of gas as well. So we'll also need a lot of gas to heat our homes, as that's where most of the gas that we import actually goes to. Of course, we've had a lot of gas in the North Sea. We're trying to make sure we maximise that output from the North Sea, but the North Sea production is falling significantly, and even though we're trying to get more out of the North Sea, it's likely to continue on a downward slope, and what that means, we're going to be importing more and more gas, probably importing about 70% of our gas by the end of the next decade. And some of that comes from secure pipelines from Norway and from the continent. A lot of it's increasingly been coming on ship, liquid natural gas from places like Qatar. But if we can have our homegrown gas, as it were, from shale gas produced from onshore in the UK, I think that is a really better way of making sure we have energy security. And if people needed any reminding of that, we've had the recent events in Ukraine and the Crimea to remind us of that. So I think energy security is one of the main reasons why we should proceed with shale gas. The second reason, bizarrely enough, is actually the environment. I asked the chief scientist at DEC, Professor David Mackay, to work with Dr. Tim Stone, another very experienced energy analyst, to look at the environmental issues around shale gas, and there are quite a number. The one I really wanted them to look at was the issue, the impact on climate change, particularly from the UK's impact on climate change. And because shale gas would effectively be substituting for LNG, for gas on ships, liquefied gas brought from the other side of the world, the carbon footprint of exploiting, producing and burning gas that's from shale gas from the UK compared to our marginal supply of gas from LNG from the other side of the world, the carbon footprint of shale is less. So it's a climate change win to replace that gas with shale gas. Now the third part of the energy trilemma I talked about was affordability. And this is where I actually don't agree that suddenly we're going to see a massive reduction in prices in the UK in gas. I wish we could. I wish we could replicate the experience we've seen in America, where gas prices have fallen substantially. But all the economic evidence I've seen, all the gas analysts I've spoken to, suggest that is highly unlikely and almost certain not to happen. Why? Because the volumes of gas you would need to change the gas price in the markets that we buy our gas in would just be ginormous. At the height of the North Sea gas production, the peak production, British North Sea gas wasn't changing the European gas price that we buy and sell our gas in. Now, if you saw a European-wide expansion of shale gas, and France lifted its moratorium and exploited its shale gas, and we had shale gas from other places like Algeria and Ukraine, for example, where there's supposed to be a lot of shale gas, then maybe we would see the size of shale gas production that would move the price. But I don't see it. But there are good economic reasons for doing it despite that. There are the jobs. There is the growth. There is the tax revenue, something obviously the Chancellor's particularly keen on. So there are good reasons for doing shale gas, particularly energy security, but these other reasons as well. But of course, if there was real environmental dangers, that would be a reason for not doing it. I've talked about the climate change element, but actually when you hear people debating this, that's not what they talk about. They don't talk about the methane emissions, although I think they actually are, to me, the one we should worry about the most. But they talk about the sustainability of water. It will use lots of water. They say it could potentially contaminate the water supply. They talk about the seismic earthquakes that will be triggered. But we need our policy to be based on evidence, and the evidence for these problems, frankly, doesn't exist. We've actually put in place regulations, the toughest in the world, to monitor seismic events, although one could argue we didn't need to go quite as far as we've done. We've gone down the precautionary principle. There used to be an awful lot of seismic events when we were mining deep coal. A lot more. And we didn't worry about it then. I think the chances of anything serious happening with gas is much, much less, but we're putting in a very strict monitoring system. If you look at water sustainability, if we had a very large shale gas industry here, the people suggest that it will be less than 1% of the water that's extracted every year from British water sources. So one can really overdo that, and any shale gas use of water, the industry use of water, we still have to get the extraction permits from the Environment Agency like any other industrial activity. So that will still be, again, highly regulated. As for water contamination, well, first of all, there's no real examples of that from the United States where they have less regulation, it's fair to say, but there are no examples of that water contamination. And if you look about the way we have gone about regulating onshore oil and gas, which we've done in conventional means for more than a century, we have, again, tough regulations. So anyone who's drilling a well has to employ an independent well examiner to examine the integrity of the wells. You have double-skinned wells. I won't go into all the details. I'm sure Andrew knows a lot more about the technical side of that. But from my point of view, checking to see whether I felt those environmental issues like protecting our water sources, whether they have been dealt with, I was completely reassured. So, I don't think there are those environmental challenges. And to the extent there are, we put in place tough regulation to make sure they are of no concern. So I think we need a more balanced debate. I don't think the environmental challenges are serious, but I equally don't think this is some huge silver bullet for energy policy. We need a mixed energy policy. You need renewables in all their forms, be it onshore wind, offshore wind, solar, tidal. You need new nuclear, you need carbon capture and storage, you need energy efficiency. You can't put all your eggs in one basket when you're looking long term, particularly when technology is changing so dramatically. So, one can be pro-shale, but realize that it's not the answer to everything. Let me end, if I may, just on the challenges as we go forward, because we are trying to get some momentum in this process, but we're also trying to make sure we reassure communities. Because despite what I've said, and Andrew will know about this because he's gone and talked to many communities around the country, people are suspicious. They don't trust governments. I don't know why, but they sometimes don't. They don't, by the way, trust energy companies. So we need to reassure them. We really need to reassure them the regulations are being put in place, that they'll be properly enforced, that people have gone through the scientific analysis, and indeed that there will be community benefits for their area as well. It won't be just a company coming in, taking all the money and leaving them. So we're trying to put that in place. It will be difficult reassuring communities, because one of the things that you can't deal with very easily is the traffic, the local traffic that will be created as a result of exploration and production of shale gas. But there are ways that are being developed to try and minimise that as well. We've got to make sure the EU doesn't over-regulate. I speak as a passionate pro-European, but I've been working hard with my dear colleague Owen Paterson to make sure the EU commissioners don't over-regulate, because we actually have plenty of European regulations that would apply. We've got to make sure one or two other legal issues are properly dealt with within our own jurisdiction. So there are challenges ahead, but we need to meet them because the prize is worth going for.
Thank you, Right Honourable. There's a lot, that was really insightful, and I'll pick up on some of what you said a bit later. I want to address my next question to Andrew Austin, who's the founder and CEO of IGas Energy Plc, and he's been participating in energy for the last 3 decades. Andrew's a successful entrepreneur and really has been the energy behind IGas. And his favourite film is Local Hero.
Thanks for that.
Andrew, today's petroleum economist leads with make or break time for shale gas. And it claims that the industry will be decided in the next 12 to 18 months. As an operator, what needs to happen, and how important is what Right Honourable talked about, how important is social engagement? What are you hearing? What are the concerns you're hearing? And what steps are you taking to address these concerns?
Thank you very much indeed, and thanks again for the invite to come and talk to everybody here. Do I think the next 12 12 to 18 months will be make or break for the shale gas industry. Well, I think on a global basis, the shale gas industry has already changed the geopolitical landscape. I think what's happened in the United States has effects not only on energy policy, but also on climate change policy, on the US, the effect of a shift to gas from coal on the US's emissions position is enormous. But it also will affect world politics. It will affect the way in which countries interact with each other as more indigenous sources of hydrocarbons are able to be exploited. But so I think the change has already happened. Shale gas, whether it happens in the UK or not, has already had an effect on the UK's energy mix and will continue to do so. Even if it ends up that we're not only importing gas from Qatar or other places around the world through LNG, but even if we end up in years to come importing gas from the United States, there will be an effect on the UK economy as a consequence of shale gas. And also on our foreign policy as well, and as is being evidenced by what's going on in the Caucasus. So going to what needs to be done in this country, I think the Minister gave a very, very sound explanation of all of the issues that make it up and a lot of the benefits. But I'd like to go a little bit more into the local benefits. And I think it's about talking to people. It's about engaging with the communities you're within. It's about discussing. It's about informing people. People have a right to be concerned about things they don't understand and that they are not fully informed on. And unfortunately, some of the detractors for the industry mix up different aspects of what the Minister just went through in terms of the effects on climate change, the effect of well integrity and protecting aquifers, the effect of induced seismicity through our activities. And these things get all jumbled together into a place that says, well, we just really shouldn't be doing this. And it's the responsibility of us as the industry, and as the Minister said, we are not trusted because we're seen as those that are coming in and potentially profiteering. The government has more trust than we do, and regulators do as well, and they have a part to play. And actually, the government, through the coalition, has actually been very responsible in the way in which they've gone through that process. And as a structural skeptic of politics, to see different departments of government working together, the Department of Energy and Climate Change, the Department of Communities and Local Government, the Environment Agency and others, the Treasury, coming together and saying, how can we make this work for Britain? And how can this actually happen? And then, okay, the companies need support when they are communicating with communities. Let's go out into those communities and talk to them. But the onus of that has to be on us as operators and as responsible operators, to give people that confidence in what we're doing. We can only do that by showing them what we've done in the past, and as the Minister said, we have a long history of oil and gas exploration in this country. And we've been very good at it, and we have a gold standard of regulation. So this country is sometimes not very good at being proud about the things that we do well, but the oil and gas industry is something we do well. And first mover advantage applied in the North Sea with Aberdeen, that the UK was an early mover in the North Sea, and as a result, a large amount of the skills and jobs and economic development associated with the North Sea has gone through the British side, through the UK side sections of the North Sea, and has actually become global leaders in exporting technology, deep water technology and other technologies to other parts of the world. So the opportunity for Britain is significant. It's jobs, direct jobs. It's also the opportunity to build skill centres like Aberdeen has been for the offshore industry, somewhere in the UK for the onshore industry. It's about really old-fashioned concepts like balance of payments. If we can produce our own oil and gas, the contribution directly back to our economy, in the same way as the UK economically was transformed in the 1980s and 1990s through North Sea oil, in the same way as it was transformed in the 30s through to the 40s through, and into the 50s and 60s through coal. The UK has moved itself forward significantly at various times in its past through the exploitation of domestic resources, but doing it in a well-regulated and an engaged way that benefits the wider community, that benefits the civil society, that this organisation is here to support. And I think that's really important. But to do that, we have to get the confidence of the communities in which we operate. And we have to do that by taking time to allow people to understand and separate out the different issues which the Minister so eloquently split out. Climate change. If we are going to have to use fossil fuels of any description to supplement carbon neutral technologies like wind, solar and nuclear through a decarbonisation of the economy, then we are better using gas than we are coal. And if we are going to use gas, we are better using gas close to home than importing gas from other parts of the world. Gas is an important part of other industrial processes, not just the generation of electricity. It is a minority proportion of gas is used for the generation of electricity. The majority of it is used either for heating or for industrial processes. And that, when I talk to people in the areas where we have licenses, the industrial users want the confidence of knowing they have indigenous supply, secure supply, that they're not going to be the vagaries of ships of LNG from other parts of the world in terms of price, to be able to have the confidence to invest and keep energy-intensive industries in a highly regulated environment like the UK. And the danger is that those technologies go to other places which are less well regulated, where emissions are less well monitored, and then you have a much bigger impact on the planet. So, talking to people, helping people understand, making the jobs go local, making more of the supply chain localized to the areas in which people accept the minor inconveniences, as I would call it, as I would describe it, and I'm confident that it is, of the production of indigenous hydrocarbons. Now, going to the question about scale, and one of the things that people talk to us about and worry about is the industrialization of the landscape, as they refer to it. The Institute of Directors put out a report in April of last year which talked about a success case for shale in the UK, which talked about 100 sites across the country. 100 sites, that sounds like quite a lot. But IGas already operate 115 sites across the country producing conventional oil and gas every day of the year. And most people aren't even aware that they are there. 100 sites would be, when put together in one place, around the size of the Trafford Centre car park, or if you're in the East Midlands, the size of Meadowhall's car park. So this isn't an industrialisation of the landscape. This is a series of discrete activities. Rigs leave. Frack equipment and pumps leave. They come on site, they carry out their activities, and they go. And then you are left with something the size of an electricity substation. So we need to get these messages out. That responsibility is incumbent upon us. We need to make sure that we're engaging with communities properly. We need to make sure that we are, that those communities are directly benefiting, whether it's in jobs, whether it's in shares of revenues from projects, whether it's in local rates. One of the things that we worked hard to make sure was that business rates in the areas from sites go directly back to those local communities, so that people can then see a difference in their services or a difference in their council tax bills as a consequence of hosting on behalf of the whole nation indigenous gas supply. And so I guess my final point would be the UK is very fortunate in that it has a significant shale gas resource. One of the other advantages here is that we have a very dense resource. It's very thick compared with other parts of the world. And that means that that's the corollary, if you like, to living on a very crowded island, that single sites can actually recover much larger amounts of gas than single sites in North America. We know the gas is there. We know that we can get it out of the ground safely. We still have geological challenges to make sure we can get it out of the ground at the right rate to make it economic. If we can do that, then the country deserves the chance to see whether or not this can make the kind of difference for Britain that was made by the North Sea in the last century and by the coal industry in the century before. But it is incumbent on us to communicate with a civil society and to be good neighbours and to be responsible in the way in which we operate, operating in conjunction with regulators to do this safely and in preservation of the planet.
Thank you, Andrew. My last preliminary question is to Professor Alan Riley, who's Professor of Law at City University amongst his specialties, he is energy law. He also advises government, EU, NGOs and corporations on geostrategic issues. And he's a regular columnist for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the FT. Professor Riley, I just want you to please bring some balance to the panel. And
Already?
And just please give us an understanding of what really are the environmental concerns. You know, the water contamination, it requires huge amounts of water, the water disposal issues, and the known seismic issues. I mean, it's been proven in the US that to have caused seismic shifts. So can you please just give us that side of the public concern?
Okay. Where do I start? I agree with Ed. I think that's maybe where I start. The Secretary of State is entirely right on this. What I would say is that there is, well, I think you would start with saying there are certain things, how can I put this? Some of the American experience it's very different, and people draw consequences, draw implications from the American situation, which are simply not relevant. Let me take with the seismic issue. There was some seismic activity in the United States, but it wasn't from fracking. What the Americans were doing is like out in the middle of nowhere, I don't know, in Wyoming or something, they would actually put the waste material and inject it back into the ground. Now, we wouldn't, the Environment Agency would have a fit if you try to do that in the UK, and there'd be massive regulatory consequences. But they do that. They don't care. It's in the middle of Wyoming. Who cares? And if you do that sort of thing and you put too much in, you can actually create pressures which will create seismic activity. That is not going to happen in the United Kingdom. That's not going to happen anywhere in the European Union. It's just not going to happen. And so the seismic activity you're talking about isn't actually from fracking or from any procedure would ever happen in the United Kingdom, period. Equally, if there are, I've seen Friends of the Earth and various other environmental groups put pictures of all of these wells, all these well pads all over the place in various American states. But that is a result of US property rights, because the subsoil rights aren't owned by the Crown, but by individual landowners. And what you have, one of the big expenses which we don't have in the UK is that the energy companies have all these landsmen who go out and they do deals with each of the landowners. And so you have different companies having different different leases, and so they can only drill in that particular area, and they have to put a well down, and so that's why you end up with lots and lots of well pads. I mean, sometimes they can do deals between them, but if they can't, then you have lots and lots of wells. And that's why you have that pot-marked environment. Plus also, often, if you're out somewhere in the middle of nowhere and you don't really care and you can put all these things out, you can have lots of wells. But you don't need to do that. I mean, you can now when you put the horizontal drill down, you can go out 10 kilometres. So the number of wells you need is much less, as Andrew was saying. And you can actually have, because ours is so deep, and it is amazing, to give you some idea of this, is that some people say, oh, the Boland Shale in the north of England, it looks like the same size as the Barnett Shale. And in geographical land terms, that's true. But and that's the point Andrew was getting at, and it is actually important to understand this in terms of its size. The Marcellus Shale the Barnett Shale in Texas is about 300, the total organic content where the shale gas is about 300 feet thick. What we've got in the Boland Shale is between 5,000 and 7,000 feet thick. So you've got something which is potentially 20 times the size of the Barnett Shale, which is one of the great resource shales in the United States. There are huge issues about geology and depth and whether we can get it all out. But my argument is that we should at least try, because if it turns out we can access this, the consequences for the British economy could be very substantial. And that's one of the points about it. I mean, the environmental issue, there is an environmental issue with shale gas, both a positive and negative one. And I think the positive one is this, that one of the huge problems with the whole energy climate change debate is there's a lack of emphasis on priority. What is the most important thing? It's one of the questions I ask my students every year. What is the most important thing? And the most important thing I would submit is this. It is that between 1960 and 2000, the consumption of coal increased by 50 quads, which is a vast amount of coal. Between 2000 and 2010, the amount of coal consumption increased by a further 50 quads. And frankly, if we keep doing that, and this is largely driven by Chinese and Southeast Asian growth, which at one level is understandable because they have a right to a good life and economic development. But if we keep doing that, we are going to fry the planet. And one of the great potentials of shale gas, and this is, if we look at it on a global perspective, is that there is there is so much of the shale gas available worldwide. One of the things about it, and this is kind of the geostrategic issue, is that traditionally we've lived with, for the last 40 years, the 80-10 ratio, that 80% of all the oil and gas on the planet is in OPEC countries and Russia, and 10% in OECD countries and China. And essentially, with around 30 trillion cubic meters of potential reserves in the United States, apparently even more, 36 trillion cubic meters according to the US Energy Information Administration in China, and lots in Argentina and the rest of the world. That geostrategic ratio is imploded. There are significant geostrategic advantages in all of that, and it could change the world in many ways. But from an environmental perspective, the massive opportunity is that we're able to smooth the growth of CO2 emissions if there could be a significant switch in China and Southeast Asia from using coal to using gas being around 50% less CO2 emitting. And one of the really potential valuable roles the United Kingdom could play is by coming up with a world-class regulatory regime which can be copied across the world. And that is something which we could give as a gift to the rest of the world, which would have a significant impact on CO2 emissions. And in terms of priority, that, I would argue, is the greatest environmental priority. Now, let me just talk about the negative. The negative is this. If we do all of this, we could have loads of gas worldwide, and people would think that is fantastic. And to some degree, it is fantastic in terms of what it could do for the CO2 emissions and give us more time. The danger is that we end up in gas complacency, and this is the great environmental problem, I think, looking forward. That we have all this gas and we sit there and think this is fantastic, and we stop trying to do much about the climate beyond that. And whilst we get this time period, of extra grace period, because the CO2 emissions don't go up as perhaps they would have done because we cut out so much coal, we still ultimately have to deal with the CO2. And one of my arguments with my friends in Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth is to say, look, you should support shale gas for the short to medium term, but you say, in return for this, we want a carbon tax. We want royalties from the shale gas to go into R&D, into renewables. We want a significant supported deployment of renewables alongside the shale gas. Now, that is, I think, is where we need to go. We need to create a structure which makes sure we don't end up in gas complacency. And that, to my mind, is the biggest environmental issue we have to deal with this. But there's the environmental positive as well. And there's one other positive issue which is not discussed, which I think is very important. And it is this. There's two, I suppose. One is that natural gas is about 80% of artificial fertilizer. And there's a real global potential for improving food security, which is not recognized at all as a result of the availability of so much gas worldwide. The other factor, and this is why I think you will see significant developing country interest and engagement with shale going forward, is that about 1.5 billion people on the planet have no power. They have no access to electricity. And because of the, for several reasons, but partly because of the massive, the extent of the shale resource base worldwide and its diversity, lots of countries will be able to access, potentially able to access that gas. The other point is that it's actually quite cheap and quite easy to put up gas combined cycle turbines. You can actually mass manufacture them. I was talking to a Turkish ship owner who was looking at creating floating gas power stations, which you could bring in to perhaps a port, an African port, and plug it into a shale gas field and start using it and provide power. It's a kind of mass production of ship-based gas-powered turbines. So there are all these sort of things which you could see are tremendous advantages, and there is a significant additional environmental advantage, because if you can do that, yes, you're using fossil fuels, yes, you're using gas, but what you're doing is you're protecting a lot of the woodlands and forestry of the planet, because what these people who don't have power are using is they're chopping down the forests. They're actually creating a lot of black soot, which is a particularly bad CO2 emitter. All of these things flow from not having access to power, and that you begin to change that if you're able to use the gas. And of course, the boon for people in terms of having power is enormous in terms of human development, access to education, access to the internet, all of this. So there are significant advantages there as well. And I think those are the sort of factors which will encourage a lot of developing countries to get engaged with shale gas going forward. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor. I'm going to be slightly unconventional now, and I'm actually going to ask each one of you to ask your fellow panellists a question. So I'll start with you, Right Honourable.
Andrew, what do you think the government needs to do to develop the shale gas industry in the UK that we've not done?
Continue doing what you're doing, but also be alongside the industry as we communicate with local communities. Be there with the confidence of the regulators, not necessarily the politicians, but the confidence of the regulators alongside us into that process, and make sure we have the right arrangements for community benefits, which actually make people feel that they are getting something out of, they are getting a community dividend from what's happening, rather than that they're being bought along the way.
Professor Riley.
To whom do I ask a question? Anybody?
Okay.
I could ask this to both of you, really. I'm sure we've all done lots of debates with various members of the kind of broader environmental movement. What do you think? What is is there a way of bringing the environmental movement into, what arguments do you think will be compelling with the environmental movement to bring them on board? Because I find it really strange. I have a lot of debates. Some people accept some of the points I'm making, but what I find it so difficult to do is to actually break through into with parts of the green movement to actually say, look, what are you really wanting here? Because we can't run with. There seems to be such a difficulty in getting through to people. And I don't know, I've been trying for ages to try and work out how, because I talk about all these things, and I read all of the issues, and I understand where they're coming from, and I support their end objective. But I find one of the difficulties I have is when I talk to a lot of people here, there is almost a kind of, the ideological blinkers come down with a large part of the green movement, and I'm not sure how we get through to people and bring them on side.
Shall I start then? To give you time to think about that?
I go first if you like.
I, like you, have a number of those debates with people, and I think in the sort of quietness of two parties talking to each other, people will say, well, hang on, surely gas is better than coal if you're going to have any hydrocarbons in the mix. Local gas has got to be better than imported gas in a highly regulated regime, as I talked about earlier on. And the argument comes back, and especially around regulation. And the argument comes back, yes, but Andrew, if you could tell me that you would leave hydrocarbons in the ground elsewhere in the world, in less well-regulated places, as a consequence of the exploiting of shale gas, then we would support you. But you can't, so we won't. So our basic position is we don't want any more hydrocarbon provinces wherever they are opened up. And unfortunately, and they wouldn't say this is my extension, but unfortunately, because of the nature of the democracy in which we live in, yeah, it's almost easier to protest against opening up another province, if you like, in the UK, than it is in some of the places Calip operates in, for instance. So it's a sort of false logic that is around this point of just trying to make sure no additional hydrocarbons are opened up anywhere, which I can understand, but it has sort of, it's a perverse incentive, if you see what I mean.
Well, I consider myself an environmentalist. I got into politics because of my views on the environment. But I think when you're faced with the threat of climate change, which I think is extremely serious, you have to look again at things that you may have learnt in your early years when you were thinking about this. So I, for example, have reviewed my own position on nuclear, because nuclear is a low-carbon technology. It has issues around the expense and waste and so on, but I think one can manage those. And I don't think you should take a low-carbon technology off the table faced with the world's need for low-carbon energy. And I think the same goes for gas. When you look at the huge amounts of coal, as Alan talked about, that's being burnt, that is rapidly taking us to unsustainable, catastrophic climate change, replacing that with shale gas is a major, major environmental win. Now, it's not after a period of years you're going to have to move away from gas. Mm-hmm. But if you have carbon capture and storage attached to gas-fired electricity power stations, then you've got low carbon or zero carbon gas potentially. And the UK is leading on CCS. So I think environmentalists need to re-examine the issues. I have some concerns with the way some of the environmental NGOs work, not all of them, and I meet them on a regular basis. Some of them are member organisations, and I think they survive on recruiting members and telling the members they're doing things, even if those things actually don't stand up to good analysis. So I think sometimes one has to actually tell the environmentalist, some of the environmental groups at least, and I'm not saying all of them, but some of them, actually, they've got their vested interests as well. And if you're trying to be neutral and objective, what is the right thing for the environment? Actually, I think a lot of the approaches that we're taking are the right ones. We're taking a very mixed approach. We're investing massively in renewables. I don't think these things are hostile to each other.
Okay, thanks. I want to pick up on a point that, Andrew, you made, which is, we were a first mover, we had a first mover advantage on conventional oil. And it's just an open question to Paolo. Why is the UK so far behind the US? What's the reason for that?
I think the US has had land issues in terms of people directly owning land rights, which enabled that to move much more quickly in the early stages. And although the UK's had a long history of onshore oil and gas production, nothing on the scale of Texas and Wyoming and various other parts of the States. So there's a mom-pop US drilling businesses which people like George Mitchell were sitting there trying to work out ways how to make money out of land which they'd purchased. And he nearly went bust in the process of just trying to get the gas or the oil directly from the source rocks rather than from where it had migrated. And so I think there's a demographic in the States, there's an industry in the States, there are land laws which push that ahead. But I think the UK is ahead in Europe, and I think its history in this area should not be underestimated, that we do understand how to drill for oil and gas. We understand it offshore, we've had a long history onshore. And now we have well-placed, when we look eastwards, to be the first mover.
Okay. Professor Riley, I just want to talk to you about energy security, which the Minister mentioned in his brief talk. And, we've heard David Cameron talk about the impact of the Russian-Ukraine crisis, and in the same sentence talk about shale gas being a solution. Mm-hmm. Is that opportunistic, or is that,
Well, I think that there is obviously the initial issue we're immediately faced with is our own kind of supply security situation, and we consume about 85 to 95 BCM a year. We produce about 43 billion cubic meters of 40-ish billion cubic meters a year of gas ourselves. The rest of it is imported. We actually are actually through a lot of actually good government policy over the years. I mean, everyone criticises UK energy policy all the time. I'm sure every Secretary of State must get kind of used to all of this. But the truth of the matter is, actually, what we've done, we put the Norwegian pipeline in place. We've got gas coming in from Norway. We have the LNG terminals. We've got the interconnectors across from the continent. So all that gives us a degree of supply security. That certainly does help. We don't really we've got the Gazprom Trading in London has an operation in which they sell kind of virtual gas. I don't know, very little actual Russian gas gets into the UK. But clearly, if there was a problem with Ukraine, Russia provided last year about 160 billion cubic meters of gas into the European Union. That's about 27% of total consumption for the European Union. About half of that came through the Ukrainian transit system. So if there was, God forbid, a conflict situation in Ukraine, that would potentially threaten that. I mean, if you've got conflict going on, the ability to get gas across the networks is potentially compromised. And that would, if you look at the 2009 crisis, which lasted for a couple of weeks, that resulted in price spikes in the UK, because of course we are interconnected. We bring our LNG in, there's a huge demand for LNG in all the gasification terminals across Europe to replace supply. That will spike prices in the UK. There would be an impact if there was an issue for us. I think what David Cameron was saying was correct in the medium to longer term to provide us with supply security. But clearly, you can't drill a well tomorrow and have gas flowing from it. It's going to take about, I would think, around 3 years or so from now to get any kind of results from all the exploration, and probably another 3 years to get to commercial production. That's what we're looking at. So the medium to longer term, that's true. I mean, what we will be looking at if there is a problem, I suspect, is probably using more coal and probably using some LNG. And actually, the US shale gas revolution has had an impact on that, because one of the reasons why there is more LNG available has been because all of this LNG was actually originally, all these LNG trains were set in place, all the supply was put in place in Qatar and elsewhere for the US market. And because of the shale revolution, it suddenly has nowhere to go, and that has created more liquidity. Now, unfortunately, because of the Fukushima crisis, that has actually drained a significant amount of supply. But also what you see is because shale gas, the gas in the US is so cheap, it's also displaced significant amounts of coal-fired power stations. So there's a lot of liquidity in the US coal market, and that coal is being dumped in Europe. So actually, one of the ways, the kind of inadvertent effect of shale gas is that we could burn more coal. And we are doing, and we will probably, if the Russian crisis got worse very shortly, then we would probably just burn more coal. And it's not good for the environment, but for a temporary period, I suppose that what are we going to do? We need baseload. We will use whatever renewable capacity we have, and we will use coal. That's what I suspect we'll do in the immediate short term if there was a problem, and we will use LNG if it's available. Now, my understanding is that the current state of the market is that there is quite a lot of tightness in the LNG markets, but there is actually a series of final investment decisions which were made around 2011, 2012, which is bringing on more LNG capacity, liquefaction, more actual supply, so in 2015, 2016. So near term, there's probably more gas available. And one of the good things, at least about this winter, is it's very mild, and all the storage facilities are pretty full. So that's quite good. But it does illustrate that this issue about supply dependence on a few suppliers is a real question for Europe. And the Europeans are going to become particularly vulnerable, because it used to be that the Europeans, the Americans and the Chinese were all in the same boat. We all were supply dependent with the 80-10 ratio. The Americans are no longer so. The Chinese, because of their huge resource base, I think ultimately will be in the same position as the Americans. And the question for Europe is, how far do we want to be the only major economic bloc in the world which is supply dependent? It's one thing to be vulnerable when everybody else is vulnerable, but you're a lot more vulnerable if you're the only one who is vulnerable. And that is where we're heading unless we address this in supply security terms.
Minister, a final question from me, which is you've got the upcoming licensing round. There's a number of entrepreneurs in the audience here. What are the pre-qualification criteria?
They're on our website. You'll be, I hope, pleased to know that a Minister of the Crown doesn't actually get involved in the detailed licensing, because that would be deeply inappropriate. Right. That's not the sort of country that we live in. So, and I think if you look around the world, you'll be pleased to know we're not in that sort of country. So they're on the website, and it is a proper due process. Can I just add one point, though, to this discussion on energy, which is slightly off the gas point, but it's something that I've been surprised at as I've done this job and learned what's happening globally in some of the energy trends, and that's some of the really exciting things around solar. The price of solar has been tumbling far faster than anyone had expected. I mean, talking to a number of people who believe it's going to keep tumbling because it's not an engineering mechanical thing, it's a technology, and people in laboratories around the world, very clever people, are finding ways to make solar ever more efficient. And people are looking at grid parity, at solar power competing with gas in the next decade. In some countries, even quicker than that. And this is fantastic for humankind, not just because of climate change, but because of tackling poverty in the poorest countries in the world. Solar power is enabling some of our poorest people in the world to get electricity, get power for lighting in the evening, so they're not having to import oil and kerosene for their lighting. It's helping keep their medicines chilled. It's helping in their schools. I think solar is probably, along with shale gas in the short term, is one of the dramatic new technologies it will transform our world in the next decade or more.
I'm going to be slightly unconventional again, if I can get a roving mic. We're lucky today. We've got one of the most senior energy bankers here in the city, Jonathan Grundy, who's a good friend here. And I just want to ask you a question, Jonathan, if I can. What's the availability of funding for shale gas in the UK? We've seen Andrew access the equity markets. How far away are we from real reserve-based lending and the debt capital markets being open to UK shale gas?
Thanks, Galen. Look, I think in short, I think there's some substantive funding available. I think UK, compared to a number of other jurisdictions around Europe, is now increasingly one of the more advanced. I think there are large utility companies in the UK that would be quite keen to find available capital to invest in shales in the country. I think it's an interesting question as to ultimately whether they'll be allowed to put the premium on the price of power to allow them to generate the funding to make those investments. But I think in terms of the equity funding, I think there's no question that there's a significant number of smaller independent companies now who are keen to make those investments. I think there are larger balance sheet companies that are keen to make those investments, Centrica obviously being one that's already shown its interest. And I think from a funding perspective, I think we saw some considerable liquidity constraints 3 or 4 years ago in terms of lending to conventional oil and gas companies and some of the unconventional companies. But I think today there is a lot more liquidity available given the rate environment that we're now in. So I think both from a debt and equity perspective, I think there is quite considerable funding.
Thank you for being so patient to this moment here.